Both of them are uh, high government servants, I would say. We're with from the UK with Town Councillor Simon Parks, who can best describe his background, and also with U.S. Marine Captain Randy Cramer's special section, I must add.
It's always important to add the special section. Otherwise,
yes.
otherwise we're not making the right distinction there. Thank you.
Exactly. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you for having me again, Alfred. It's great to be back.
Yes. Thank you for joining us on what we conceived as a special roundtable. And what the roundtable part of it is really to encourage this as an opportunity for a conversation amongst yourselves, because you are extraordinary Earth human beings, in that you have personally experienced either face to face and or interdimensionally or both up close and personal experience with reptilian extraterrestrials, mantid beings, and in a very inside of a strategic military or intelligence context and or otherwise. And I would say that you're both very considered officers of state, either formal or informal. And by that I mean that Simon, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you are an elected public official, a town councillor in North America, as you stated. We would call that a city councillor. However, you've also been given tours of the secret military bases in the UK, meaning that the UK is confident enough of you so as to give you some insight of what they're doing. And Randy, you are active in public under authorization of Article 21 of a special Marine Corps regulations, which under circumstances were either 50% of...
I'll just quickly interject here. That's specifically under the United States Marine Corps Special Section, Special Code of Conduct.
Exactly. Which makes it official. And right. You have been authorized by your chain of command to go public because there has been a official finding, that one of these two conditions obtain or both, that either 50% of the constitutional guarantees in the U.S. Constitution are not, in fact, in place because of actions of an extraterrestrial origin or of an extraterrestrial civilization, or second, that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, 75% of the normal functioning government operations of the United States are somehow compromised. Is that the sense of it, or?
You're pretty close there. It's either a 50% or greater reduction or compromise in personnel of the known apparatus of state or government, or a 75% reduction in overall effectiveness or use. So if you're essentially, we see the gears grinding to a halt, at greater than a 75% rate, it's considered to be hostile and an aggressive act that's trying to, bring us to a slowdown or a shutdown, which is not a good thing at all, and therefore can be seen as a hostile act and crosses a condition line where you can say, before that, someone else should have done their job, but if they didn't by the time we get to that 75% mark, then these other clauses go into effect so that officers can take action in their best moral conscience and so forth, like that.
Okay, now, does that 75% have the condition that condition has to obtain to an extraterrestrial cause, or can it be to a terrestrial cause?
It's presumed at this point that that regardless of whether it's a terrestrial or extraterrestrial cause, sort of at its origins,
Yeah.
that because of all the players that are involved, that it's presumed to be a hostile action from someone outside of us or
Okay.
threatening us. Whether it's internal or external becomes irrelevant. It's clearly someone who's threatening the apparatus and the functionality of state at that point, which is sedition and treason, and threatens the entire apparatus and the safety of everyone.
Okay, just to be clear. So I just wanted to establish, um, Simon and Randy, that you're really here both as state actors. Uh, Simon, would you agree with that?
It's quite a loaded question there, Alfred.
I know. That's my job.
I think I share something with Rand in that, in many ways, the establishment doesn't quite know where to sit us. Some arms of the establishment would clearly like to use us for its own purposes, while other arms of the establishment just want the truth to come out. Both Randy and I have been given either formal or informal protection. In my case, I've been given very obvious support. And so, in a way, yes, is the answer, Alfred. The establishment is backing us to a certain degree, and perhaps only part of the establishment is backing us.
Yes, yes. Now, having gotten that out of the way, just so that our viewers understand uh, the full context of our round table, um, shall we go to the first part of it? And that is to really introduce the viewers in a conversation, because both of you have had experiences with mantids, for example. And I wondered if starting with Simon, you could say in 3 or 4 minutes just describe yours, and then Randy, if you could come in and begin to talk to each other as a round table and see what the comparative, what points of comparison and differences you can come up with, almost as though we're at a seminar.
Okay, all right. It'll be interesting for Randy because he's been in combat with certain different races. And I don't know if the listeners who are going to listen to this will remember the one I did with you, Alfred, but I talked about 1971 when I made a soul agreement with a mantid, or as the North Americans say, a mantis. And part of that agreement was that my soul could be taken from my body and placed into a mantis body, and then I would then go out and do certain things. So it'll be quite interesting for Randy because when we interact, I will have two viewpoints. One viewpoint as somebody who lives on this planet now, but as somebody who has inhabited a mantid soul, and taken a somewhat different view. So my experience with the mantis really goes down to the time when I was asked to choose who did I want to associate with. Would it be the Draconis reptilian, or would it be the mantis? And I chose to be more involved with the mantis and not the Draconis. And although the Draconis retreated from my life, it never completely left it. So from a very small child, I have experiences of mantis creatures. I also have experiences of shadow creatures, the feline species, crystalline creatures. Very rarely see the greys. I do not get on with the greys at all. They're corrupt humans, or some of them are. The robotic greys I've absolutely no time for because they have no soul in them. But I don't see many of them. So I'm more associated with the mantis than any other being, but I'm very familiar with the Draconis reptilian. And these visits and associations are ongoing. I've probably got a minute left now, Alfred.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm just conscious that I don't want to talk for too long. When I first went public, then the media, the established media, did attack me, as you would expect. And then something very odd happened. In Britain, we have what we call the Ministry of Defence, which is the government ministry that is in charge of all the decisions taken at a military level. And I was invited for a tour of a secret space radar base, which actually isn't British, it's American. It's run by the National Security Agency, but because it's based on Britain, then obviously the British are in charge of the front door, for want of a better purpose. And I had a 4-hour tour around that space base. And this completely was a game changer, because how was it that this guy, Simon, whose mother actually worked for MI5, but was really working for the NSA, whose grandfather worked for MI6, but who was really working for the CIA, and who went public that he had these alien contacts, why was this guy being given a 4-hour tour around a very top secret base, and at the end of it was presented with a little medallion? There were 15 of us in the tour, and I was the only non-military person there. And at the end of it, I was presented with a small coin. There were only 500 of them made in the world, made by the Americans. And they were to be given to generals, admirals, presidents, prime ministers. And there I am, just a humble city councillor. And at the end of it, I'm given a presentation. And when I go around and do my lectures, of course, I carry it with me and show people. So it comes back to your question that, yes, the establishment is involved there. So I hope in a nutshell I've tried to give a picture there, Alfred.
Good. Yes, Randy, could you just kind of respond and talk about your interactions with mantids over the next 3 to 4 minutes, 3 minutes or so?
Sure. Primarily, my first interaction was essentially a intelligence briefing and virtual training experiences. So my first interactions was more like a virtual 3-dimensional video game experience, which was quite terrifying because we're just sort of assaulted by swarms and swarms and swarms of insects, just over and over and over again. And it's kind of freaky. I still don't like swarms of bugs or stinging insects. It still kind of weirds me out. Now, I'm still the guy that, if I see a bee, struggling on the sidewalk, I go, oh, come here, little bee, let me help you out. I mean, I don't hate insects in any way, shape, or form, but they still give me the creepies and the willies sometimes because of that combat trauma experience. So my first experience was just like, this is the enemy, this is the beast, this is what you have to be concerned about. And my first physical interactions with them were just, combat oriented, which were really, really messy. I don't know any other nice way or without trying to be graphic. It was just not it was just a very unclean, messy experience, both physically, emotionally, tactically, strategically. It's just a very, very messy experience trying to engage in combat with an organized insect hive mind. I'll just have to say that. They're incredibly organized, and it's really difficult to sort of tactically approach an opponent like that without having to really think outside the box, because they just defy 9 out of 10 of the reasons that you think when you do A, your opponent is going to do B, but you're presuming that basically on sort of the million interactions and psychological processes, and not on an insect hive mind, which is completely different. So it really changes the day. I will say, however, that my first experience that was peaceful with them was kind of on my own impetus, really. We had regular patrols, which is part of our daily routine, and so
these are on Mars.
On Mars, yes, correct.
Just to set the context for the viewers.
Correct. I'm sorry. Yeah, this is beyond the surface of Mars between 1987 and like I'm talking sort of between 1987 and 1995 is sort of my first interactions, and before this first time that I actually encountered them personally was probably about, would have been maybe about 1990, 91, sort of. I'd only been there maybe 3 or 4 years. And so we were on a patrol, and we were, coming across this sort of territorial line where we could see the mantids out sort of from their hive, engaging in some sort of activity. Looked like they were bringing things out and sort of laying lines out of things and sort of into the daylight or into the sun, it turns out, for some reason. And as we were watching and doing our patrol, and we're supposed to just get to a certain point, observe whatever's happening, and then return, and I just found myself like really trying to think hard about everything that I could remember from junior high or high school biology class about insects. And I said, I'm willing to bet that if I put down my gun and I walk over there, not threatening, that they're not going to attack me. And essentially, the squad was like, sure, go ahead. We don't think you're correct necessarily about that, but yeah, you want to go get ripped apart, sure, we'll jump in and grab your head and take you back and get you rebuilt again, like always. But, we don't think that's necessarily a good idea. And I said, well, you know what? I think it is. So I don't think that approaching as a singular entity that I'm going to get attacked. And if I'm wrong, then I will come back running, screaming, I was wrong, I was wrong. But that's not what happened. So I put down my weapons and I approached. And the closer I got, obviously, the more I could notice that they were attending that I was approaching. And then when one of the, I'd call them sort of one of the more intelligent drones, which are sort of a, 5.5-ish feet tall, sort of combination of what I would say between a mantid person or a mantis person and an ant person, and sort of, approached and was communicating psionically pretty clearly. We had a very brief conversation about, hi, I'm from up there and we live over there, and, hi, I'm from up there and we live over here. And we essentially were able to start, a passive enough dialogue at that point that when I went back and filled out my report, a CO called me in and was like, did you really walk up to the front of the hive and just wave and say hi? And I said, yeah, I did. I just walked up and waved and said hi. And he just kind of shook his head and said, wow, that is brass buttons, my friend. That is really brass buttons. And it essentially, so what we did at that point was, I know that the diplomatic corps was engaging in diplomatic conversations with the insects and with the mantids at that point. Even though we were continuing to sometimes engage with them militarily, that didn't seem to stop the diplomatic process from going on. They really seemed to be very independent, mechanically of one another. And I would say by the time that we settled into a temporary peace agreement, we had an exchange program where a couple of squads of soldiers and some officers from the diplomatic corps on a daily basis, we'd get up in the morning, the barracks, and head over to the hive and spend the day with the mantids and their and then mostly the diplomatic corps officers doing, their diplomatic corps stuff, and the soldiers just sort of helping out and standing around. But we would still engage and communicate, and found it a very interesting process. And I was completely astonished at their incredible intellect, their brilliant understanding of biochemistry, genetic engineering, and the science stuff that they're really, really focused on. They're really, really good at. So at first, we just sort of think that, they're giant kind of smart insects. No. They're just like really smart, genius evolved scientists that can really do some amazing things. My understanding pretty much of how they did almost everything was they didn't build much of anything. They engineered things. They designed things and then would make an insect or a bug or a thing that would do that process or do that function, and then could recycle back into a system that's recycling organic matter all the time, being managed sort of by a queen hive mind into sort of a collective of souls of other smaller souls in the hive mind that are all experiencing hive consciousness. Anyway, I could go on a bit, but it was fascinating. It was very fascinating, incredibly interesting. But also, I will just point out, it was a little weird. Like, I had to go to medical and get, some prescriptions for anti-anxiety medication and stuff when I was doing this duty, because I would get so nervous and so anxiety-ridden being surrounded by all of these insects that I was used to, only being surrounded of when I was in, defensive combat with. So there was a serious anxiety that I had to deal with, and they were cool with. to the point where I had to get an anxiety drug prescription so that I could calm down for a while in their presence, because I was just too freaked out at being around giant bugs still.
Thank you for that remarkable summary. Now, I'm just having gotten this out. Simon, having heard and seen Randy's experience and introduction to mantids, to us mere earth dwellers, I was wondering, would you like to ask Randy some questions, or first make some observations, as you say, a person of dual or integrated human mantid essence? Please feel free to engage.
Two statements, one question.
Yeah.
The first statement is,
yeah, sure.
The first one is that it's a patriarchal society, not a matriarchal society.
Okay,
so
that's interesting. Okay.
Male that runs the hive. Secondly, Randy is absolutely right. Whatever combat or battle goes on, the diplomacy carries on without any issue whatsoever. That's the domino game that takes place is the game of life, and that's just the way it is. The question I have for Randy, excuse me, is, Randy, were you at that time employed by the United States military in one shape or another, or were you employed by a multi-corporation private company?
This is a very good question, and my understanding, the only way I know how to explain that is to say that the Mars Defense Force, the Mars Defense Force is a private military contractor who is contracted by the Mars Colony Corporation. So the MCC is sort of this financial organizational arm, and the MDF is not directly owned or commanded by the MCC. They are contracted, but they have to be made up of some of these other military contractors, which are still make up the EDF and Naval Space Command and these other military agencies. So it becomes managed as a private military organization, which means it's infused with a lot of corporate management. But yes, you still have a hierarchy of soldiers and officers who are contracted and coming right out of these other direct military programs in order to run that private military organization, because they've definitely learned the mistake of letting private industry individuals actually get their hands in the military part. That's a very, very bad thing to let happen, and you still always want to have the military folks running the military programs whenever you can. But that still means that the corporate people get their fingers in everything as far as what tools are being approved or used, or policies are being approved or used. But I will say that the military commanders, have a certain amount of ability to put their foot down and say, no, this is garbage. And I can tell you a number of times when my commanding officer at Forward Station Zebra on several issues really just said, no, this is stupid. We are not doing it this way anymore. This is harming my effectiveness of my soldiers. This is harming our day-to-day morale. This is harming our ability to function. This is harming our ability to perform in the field. And so I will not be doing it that way. We will be doing it this way or else. And seeing, essentially the MCC have to capitulate to military command when military command says, absolutely not. We will not be doing that way. It's a back and forth. It's a back and forth of power.
Okay, two questions. Would it be right to say that at a point Dick Cheney was probably in charge of that particular arm? And would it also be say that at the time that you were on Mars, the humans had the technology to bring you back to life had you been physically dead?
I would say to that first part that Dickie Cheney is almost assuredly involved at somewhere in these areas, and exactly what level he would have been involved in the MDF or the Earth Defense Force, I couldn't say specifically, but I would almost be certain that his thumbprints and his fingerprints would be all over it somewhere. And then, yes, I would also say that we definitely had the technology at that point You know, I've had my arms and legs and my body blown apart so many times and rebuilt and put back together. So, and as long as there's some electrical activity that they can connect, you know, your cord to, they can still bring you back. They're still retrievable, and they'll still bring your soul back into your body. It's when that connection is completely gone that you become all the way dead, or as we used to say.
That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much. Thank you.
Wow. Please continue. I mean, this is a remarkable disclosure roundtable.
Well, what we're seeing here is things that people don't read on the internet. What you haven't read in a book. You would only know this if you were actually really there, or whether you had very close connection with it. So the sort of questions I'm asking Randy, he couldn't answer if he just read it on the internet or a book. He would have had to have experienced it. So, and I would only ask the questions because I am aware of it. So what makes it so lovely is that you know, there are 3 very genuine people on this round table at the moment.
Excellent. Let's go over and Randy, do you have would you like to make a statement about what Steinman has said, and then ask him questions?
Okay, I guess I'm curious. I mean, why wouldn't you be curious necessarily about Dick Cheney's involvement? Because he's, I mean, or somewhat, I like to call him Darth Cheney, really, because he's such, you know, this figure who's just always trying to be behind and controlling so much of everything, and there's just not a single indication that he's up to anything other than, you know, bad feelings all around, and that, you know, the dark side of the Force moves through him with great strength. I just don't know how else to describe him. So I just find it curious why you would ask that question specifically. I think that my question would sort of center around, we had a limited experience with the hive, meaning sort of we really only experienced one hive, but there were multiple hives that were run by, you know, multiple collective consciousness. And my question being, because this has always been a note of curiosity to me, the hive consciousness that exists from, you know, the sort of top down from a hive, how connected or as much of the same hive consciousness is that from hive to hive or queen to queen, or does that change? Does it really have sort of a more of a division, like people or individual persons have a division even though they're collectives? This is a very interesting subject to me, and since I don't really have an experience with multiple hives to be able to judge that, I would have to ask the question. If you could answer that, I'd be dying to know.
Okay, there are no queens. It's a patriarchal society. The pyramid shape is good. That works. There is one, and his title in English would be simply the Great One.
Okay.
The Great One. That is what you're referring to as the Queen.
Okay.
Although he's male.
Okay, sure. I can totally understand my confusing of that, because this certainly is the grand progenitor, the grand engineer, and the grand maker of everything. And I think that just communication was always purveying that was the Queen. So thanks for clarifying that. I'll try to make sure I clarify that in the future.
In different locations on different planets, different universes, there will be what you're describing a standalone unit, which would be one hive. Okay. That hive, if I can put that here and a hive here, this is the communication that you're asking from. So you would have from the center, it wouldn't come from one hive who would then pass it to another hive, which is perhaps how we would do it in Earth human terms. One command center would be responsible for feeding off to others. This comes from one to all simultaneously, so that if one arm is cut out, all the separate hives have the same information at the same time. Now, there is communication from one hive to another, but that isn't reporting, that's just status. So it's not reporting, it's just a continual update of what's happening. It's not a chain of command which goes that way. So that's that's how that works. So you could take out one hive. That's my cat behind me going mad.
Yes, I see that. You're very acrobatic.
Yes, I thought it was a gin for a moment, Alfred, but it's just a cat. So yeah, you could take out one hive, but all the others would be standalone. So I don't know if that helps in any way.
Oh, that completely answers my question. Yes, thank you very, very much. That helps a lot.
Okay.
Right. Would you like to have some? Would anyone like to come forth with a follow-on question?
Yeah, I don't have any knowledge of being on Mars. I don't have any knowledge of that yet. I seem to have a very clear understanding of bits and pieces. Randy, would it be correct to say that certain parts of Mars were quadranted or divided off between different groupings? So a geographical area would belong to one particular race, and a geographical area would belong to another race, because I'm aware that diplomatically, in order to allow one group into another group's territory, there was a very complicated protocol. Does that make sense?
Yes, and my understanding is that, yeah, Mars is in no way a cohesive, unified, one, planetary government species, kind of a situation at all, that there are definitely multiple species and folks involved, natives and non-natives, natives maybe who went away and are coming back, and different ways that you can look at that. But yeah, my understanding, there's at least a half a dozen or so different genetically distinct species that possess and compete for a certain amount of territory. But I want to emphasize again, when people want to talk about that competing for territory, that they often assume that there's this fight for global dominance on Mars by these species, and nothing could be farther from the truth, because a long time ago it was simply determined that that was not going to be militarily or financially practical at all, and that you were simply going to have to settle for maintaining your territory and trying to keep anybody else from taking too much or pushing into any of a direction over your own territory. But the notion of any one of those species dominating all of the rest and being able to own that planet is simply a joke. It's just a joke. The idea that it could happen is ridiculous. And yeah, I mean, my understanding is some are more friendly and on better terms than others, and some are obviously more hostile. I can only speak really clearly about what happened near the sort of northern polar regions where I was at, involving our stations, these northern tribe, reptiles tribes, and the mantid tribe species that we dealt with.
The raptor ones, aren't they the ones that are associated with the United States Navy? Is that right? Is it the Air Force or the Navy that have connections with them?
The Navy definitely does. I don't think I'd be authorized to comment on that, because I don't know enough about it, and if I would be saying something that would harm anything in a secure way, I wouldn't know that necessarily either. So I'd be best not to say anything specifically, other than that, yeah, the Navy is certainly, Naval Space Command and United States Marine Corps Special Section, I know, still has diplomats constantly communicating with the Northern Tribe Raptors. Yeah.
That was my understanding. That's brilliant. Randy, there's a couple of films which I'm sure you've seen, and I think will mean a lot to you. And one obviously is Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yeah. And the other one is Ender's Game. Have you seen Ender's Game?
I did. I saw it not too long ago, and it was really mind-blowing as far.
Wasn't it just?
Yeah, I mean, I had friends who'd seen it who were telling me, no, you really want to see this movie. It's about the training program. And I was like, okay, we'll see how good it is. And I was quite shocked and quite stunned to see just how clear they were being without being more clear.
And you see the mantis type creature at the end of the film?
Yes, I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was brilliant.
In actual fact, the Ender's Game is stock filming for the Marine Corps. It's actually on their list of approved films to watch when they're in their training.
I'm not surprised at all. I'm not surprised. In fact, In fact, I really, so many times hearing lines, being quoted from these officers that I would just swear I have heard these same bullet points, rattled off to me by my same chain of command, that I have a hard time not believing that somebody helped write the script for that. So
Sure.
it really seemed not just like someone said, hey, I got a good idea for you. I think someone came to somebody with a ready script and said, why don't you make that movie?
Yes.
Yeah, but it's great. It was fantastic. And I think anyone who wants to try and understand the sort of mentality of these programs and who is being used and why they're being made and what direction they're trying to be directed in order to develop skills and so forth. No, I think it's a great example.
I think it's very important because it actually shows children being trained, which is what you were saying. And anybody who's understands military discipline knows that, and Adolf Hitler understood it entirely when he trained the Hitler Youth, that if you get children at a young age, you can create a very, very effective fighting force. And that is exactly what the military or the large corporations who own or part own some of these military programs have been doing for a while. So it's really nice for me to actually meet Randy and to chat with him, because we're seeing things from, yes, the same perspective, but also a slightly different perspective. But we are not antagonists. That's very important to make clear, because had I been a greatly more reptilian type being, I would probably be having a real problem with Randy right now, Alfred. But that is not the case.
Why do you say that? What would if you were a reptilian being, what is there about Randy and what he's doing or saying that would bring out problems?
Well, Randy has more than average reptilian in him anyway. He knows that is the case.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And Randy's, again, is absolutely correct that the parts of Mars, as other planets are, which are segmented off, your own operational field is defined. The reptilian grouping finds it very hard to play within the rules, and will attempt both physically and non-physically to expand its influence. And so somebody like Randy is probably what he represents is basically, if you go too far, you are going to have conflict on an ongoing basis. And so you are constantly reminded with somebody like Randy on a planet's surface that the humans have, yes, they're there by agreement, but they also have their own agenda. And the Mantids are incredibly spiritual in some ways and incredibly ancient and learned, and have got so much going on that they're not that worried. But the reptiles are very much into expansion of territory, dominating species, controlling people, and so therefore what Randy represents is probably a little bit difficult for some of the reptiles. Randy can tell you more than I can about that.
Mm-hmm. Could we, just going back, Randy, you mentioned that there were 6 major species on Mars?
At least, that I'm aware of.
Okay,
yeah.
I assume that 3 of those are reptile, mantid, human. Is that correct?
We have terrestrial humans, from Earth. We also have Martian humans, who are from Mars, sort of hominids that are from Mars.
Right.
And then there's, I know Andrews described him as sort of a small, type, almost gray or zeta type being. I'm not sure what to call them, because I don't, he came up with some names, some Latin variation names, which is fine, right. But I'm not sure how they're defined in the manual, because to me, they fit a description of drone being, and so in the list of various drone beings, it's not always about what species they are, because they're drone beings. They're like biological robots, and so they can sort of essentially be operated or teleoperated or programmed by a number of other species as proxy who don't want to either engage in the environment, the biological environment. They know they're vulnerable to mold, spores, fungi, and so forth in the environment. They don't want to wear the biosuits. The gravity or the pressure is too different for them to survive in, so they'll use a biological drone to teleoperate into that area. And so my understanding is that they may not even be their own like biological species. They're just sort of like biological robots. So who they're actually being operated by or teleoperated by, I can't say, and therefore I wouldn't define them as an actual species. I would more define them as a biological drone or a biological robot. And so I'd say there's at least those species. We had, you know, a draconian infiltration that we pretty much extracted as a group effort. You know, we all got together and sort of, you know, ganged up on the draconians when they thought they were going to come in and play divide and conquer. But I would just only imagine from what I know that there's got to be a couple of other hangers on somewhere, you know, sort of in that map, even though I'm not privy to the entire map of the entire globe of Mars. But I'd say, from my intelligence sources, we got to be, you know, half a dozen or 7 or 8 species, which, you know, have territory that puts them in a position of having to be negotiated with. If you're talking about global affairs, if you're talking about Martian global affairs or things that will affect everybody. I mean, even if they're all fighting each other, there has to be some sort of loose diplomatic organization around what's acceptable and not acceptable for everyone, because that always is going to come down to it. Even if you've got people fighting, you've still got people with interests who can go, no, it's really going to cost us too much if we do that. We need to, you know, work together on this, even though we're fighting them over here. If we cooperate on this, that saves everybody time, money, and energy. That's always, I think historically, that's always been the case. Where just because you're militarily, you know, stomping on someone doesn't mean you're over here having a conversation with them about how to minimize certain negative impacts because of the war that they're having or because of some other environmental factors. So I think the fact that we've got a messy situation geopolitically shouldn't surprise us. I think that we have messy situations geopolitically on Earth. I think we should expect messy geopolitical situations on Mars and just about every other planet in the galaxy, because why wouldn't there be? Why would we presume that everyone's got some kind of orderly global functionary system where their planet is just all fine and orderly and peaceful and where everyone gets along and agrees that the laws should all be the same? I don't see why that should be the case at all. Even when you're talking about collective consciousness and hive consciousness, my experience individually was that an individual mantid could still have an opinion that was separate from the hive. It would still, you know, go with what sort of with the hive logic and the hive notion and survival of the hive, but you know, they could still sort of have an individual opinion. I don't know how else to describe that, except that, you know, one mantid soul conscious might prefer that flavor to that flavor or that color to that color in the same way that you or I might. They might be able to have that kind of an opinion because it doesn't impact the overall health or well-being of the hive, so it's not dictated by hive consciousness. Again, Simon probably knows more about this than I do. This is my impression of them. But that in and of itself, to me, just seemed like part of the individual expression, that when you have these individual life forms getting together in groups, they have many differences of opinion, and they disagree a lot, and they don't agree on how to do things and what the best way to do things are. So I think we should anticipate that intergalactic geopolitical affairs are going to be much, much, much more complicated and messy than our own geopolitical affairs because they involve more parties.
Right. Holding that issue for a moment, Simon, do you have any comments on what Randy just said about mantids?
Yes, because there is still free will, providing that free will doesn't endanger the race. There is a high council within the mantis, and it runs on a traffic light system: red, yellow, and green. Somewhat like the weapons that some of the humans have. I don't know, laser rifles, but we're talking energy hand weapons that some of the human troops carry. But anyway, the High Council, like any council, has a vote, except being telepathic. The telepathy is counted by votes, but not by raising your hand. But yes, there is free will to make decisions, but those decisions must always be for the benefit of the race. So it is quite possible that, I'll give you an example. Let us suggest that a mantid is on Earth in its true form, interacting with a human child at maybe, let's say in North America, at maybe 2:30 in the morning. And then that mantid then wishes to bring that child either to a spacecraft or to an underground base or to another dimension. And it will either take that child physically in its body, or it will take its energetic signature. Now, when it gets to wherever it's getting, let us suppose that another mantid then interacts with that child, and a new connection is made between that child and that mantid, which seems beneficial. The first mantid will say, "Shall I withdraw?" and therefore allow you to carry on. So there is free will, providing it doesn't violate the number one rule, which is the survival of the collective. Okay.
This is, I know that this might seem strange, but we are prompted by that conversation of reptilians, mantids, humans, and the different territorials. Could we transfer that same conversation to Earth and start up a conversation about here on Earth? Is there a similar struggle for territory between humans, reptilians, mantids, etc.?
No. I mean, Randy will come in with his bit. The only struggle we've had has been some of the taking out of the DUMBs, some of the deep underground bases. That's the major struggle we've seen on the planet. But the division of Earth was decided a very long time ago. In other words, the running, who was in charge and how. The difficulty we've had from a good perspective is that those elite governments now so totally control a number of countries with their corporations and their politicians that it isn't actually the aliens that are the problem anymore. It's the humans in their very, very strong positions who are just totally greedy and totally out for themselves. So from my perspective, you don't have turf war, or we say in Britain, you have countries who are seeking to push their ideology onto others. So there's that going on, but it's more to do with humans and demonic entities than it is to do with aliens, who are actually now not playing the key role they might have done 20 years ago.
Do you have any comment on that?
Oh, certainly. Terrestrial Earth geopolitics is very complicated, but I will try and say that Simon is correct. My understanding, there are no territorial conflicts in which we are concerned about mantid or insect species territorially competing for territory on Earth. The ones that I understand that are here completely based on treaties that everyone's okay with, and are not here to do harmful or negative things. Of all of the ET species that we have over the last 70 years, say, made treaties with and let them come and hang out, that's not necessarily the case. Of some of those, we've had to learn that those are bad relationships, and we've had to, break them up and break off with them, and in some cases, kick them out of the neighborhood and tell them, out, don't come back. It's very complicated, and because you have factions within factions who have different agendas going, both opposite directions on the fork in the road of sort of, do we move towards golden civilization or total fascist civilization? Because that's the tug of war. If people don't understand the tug of war, we're either tug of war for golden civilization, fascism, or it's all going to break and collapse into barbarism. That's essentially the sort of tug of war that's happening because of all these different interests. And we really have the choice of trying to understand those forces and direct it back towards golden civilization, where we shore up the things of civilization that are crumbling and falling apart, and we eliminate poverty, and we eliminate the reason for people to have to be using large amounts of bombs and chemical weapons on each other, and we make law enforcement officers accountable for killing people for committing misdemeanors or just standing leaning against a toy. There are things that have to be made accountable, and fixable in order to move in that direction. But a lot of what I think is being directed by that are, I would have to agree with Simon, it's less the ETs that were giving us the same trouble maybe 20 years ago, and we now have these proxies of human beings who are operating through sort of non-human, multidimensional beings, you know, sort of puppeteering in this corporate model, which is a draconian model. I want to point out that the corporate model, the corporate banking model, is a draconian model. The Alpha Draconian model is all about corporate banking. It's all about usury and making imaginary money to hold people in debt to, and creating, you know, hierarchical corporations to subvert law and order and so forth. That's their structure. So the fact that, you know, they infiltrated that sort of inter-earth structure by creating the East India Trading Company, the first corporation, you know, has got us down to a direction that we don't understand how to reel in business power. And I don't think that there shouldn't be business power. There should be some business power, but that's not the same thing as corporate power, and that's not the same thing as saying, you know, 90-day, you know, 3-month planning is our bottom line, what I like to call the short-term greedy model, which I'm highly against. Business models have to be, how do we make productivity, you know, in capital over 100 years, not 3 months. So what we're mostly seeing right now are some really, really, really dark psionic beings, or what some people might refer to demonic beings, dark energy, dark wizards, dark magic, whatever you want to call them. They're using very, very negative dark psionic energy to manipulate and bend reality and behavior in a certain way. I would argue that we don't have a pedophile problem because we have a pedophile problem. I would argue we have a pedophile problem because dark psionic magic users have been sending those frequencies into society over and over and over again until people start mimicking and puppeteering that behavior. And that if we eliminated those sources of psionic infiltration into that thinking, that behavior would come to an end. It would stop.
Very interesting. Do you have comments to that perspective, Simon, and your furry friend?
This is my cat, who is incredibly jealous when I texting onto him. Just,
get some attention.
Yeah, no, just absolutely agree entirely with Randy. It's getting very boring, this, isn't it, Alfred?
We just agreeing with each other all the time.
Yeah.
Well, no. These are collective perspectives that a round table comes to. That's why it's round.
Okay, all right, King Arthur. Yes, the whole of the whole of this prison planet is Draconis reptilian created in terms of its systems and its structures, which then those humans who are so desperate to climb the ladder to be something are embraced and are part of it. And sometimes it's willing and sometimes it's not willing. In most cases they are mind controlled. Bloodline families, it's a very, very interesting, if horrific, control network and control system. But you know, from a dispassionate point of view, I have to say it's very effective. And you know, and Randy will know that many people have suicide programs placed in them, so that if they begin to break the programming or they turn against their masters, they will be dead within a fortnight. Right. And as far as the authorities are concerned, they just committed suicide. So looking at one aspect, it appears to be sewn up. However, Randy's right. There is something very important going on, and slowly but surely the off-worlders, or the bad guys on the planet, are losing control, not just of the populace, but they're losing control in many cases within their own organization. There are a large number of people who are saying, you know what, I don't want this anymore. I can't live with myself. I can't live with this, and I want out. Now, as you go higher up the chain of command, this is not necessarily in the corporations, but I do believe it's in the pure military, where these people believe themselves to be custodians of the peace of the planet. That's how they see themselves, as custodians of the peace of the planet. Because when you are aware that it isn't a war with Russia that's going to cause you serious problems. It is the potential war with races from other worlds. When you know that, everything else becomes much less important. And so you begin to realize that they've had enough, that humanity has been lied to. This is such a big story, and surely human race can move on and develop. It's time to grow up. And so you have a number of people in very high office, military office, and a few politicians who have come together quite secretively, forming their own groups within groups within groups, trying to move it across. And you might get a major or a colonel in a military unit who will somewhat change the orders that he's been given. And that's what's occurring. And that's where I think we need to place our faith.
I think that's a very good assessment, and my experience in just talking, mostly conversations sort of off the record with various officers in a number of branches of the military, I find this consensus to be very true, that over the last couple of decades you have, people I really want to call the warrior caste of the United States of America, and when I call them that, I mean it with the deepest respect, because these are men and women who are officers now, whose parents were officers, whose grandparents were officers, whose great-grandparents were officers, whose great-grandparents served in the Civil War, and whose great-great-great-parents were in the Spanish-American War. I mean, there are people whose families go back for generations and have done nothing but serve this country militarily, and, have 9 generations of West Point graduates who take the usurpation of the Constitution and of this divide and conquer attitude, where let's pretend like we're mad at the Russians, let's pretend like we're mad at the Chinese, let's make up a war in the Middle East. Really see this as a serious violation of our own sort of national security apparatus, that it makes us very vulnerable. It makes us very vulnerable internally, externally. We create terrorism every time, we take our boot and stomp somebody in the head and say, do it our way. I mean, every time you do that, a child is being born, or a 4-year-old lost his mother or his uncle, who is going to hate you forever. And they're going to die hating you because, you did something that left an impression when they were 4 years old. So when they're 18, they're going to be happy to do everything they can to kill you or harm themselves or die in the process, because when they were 4, they know that the jackbooted thug of some foreign national stomped their mom or their dad or their uncle in the head. So that kind of aggression does not gain peace, does not gain submission. All it does is make people mad. And all it does is make people want to come and fight you and hurt you later. The notion of hearts and minds, that is a Marine Corps concept, and it really comes from old-fashioned wisdom. You get more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. Okay, that's, not rocket science. And the Marine Corps understood a long time ago, when you go into an area, you're dealing with 2 different groups of people fighting almost always over a bunch of, poor farmers and people who've got a couple of cows and goats to deal with. And your choice is to either look as bad as the people who you're trying to fight, or look better. And the way you look better is when you come into a community and you say, hey, you guys don't have enough food or blankets. Guess what? We got a truckload of food and blankets and rations. Here, have some stuff that will make your life a little less suffering, and we can show you we're the good guys. And the more you can demonstrate through your actions that you actually care about the people on the ground, they're going to recognize that, wow, here's a person who's actually morally upstanding, better than this guy who's telling me that I need to, rise up, because of these guys in the dirt of the jungle. Here this guy's come along and he's given us blanket and food and medicine. Wow, maybe I should really help this guy who just helped me and my family out and made sure that my little sister, who was going to look like she was going to die, is now alive because some doctor gave her a shot. The original idea of being able to help people in order for them to go, oh, you're the good guys, that's a Marine Corps concept. So the moment that we stopped being the good guy like that, the moment that we said, we're not going to give you blankets anymore, we're not going to give you health care anymore, we're not going to give you rations anymore, we're just going to give you door-to-door, kick down, boot to the head, I don't speak your language, but I'm going to point a rifle around the room until I get everybody to do what I want, that's bad policy. That's just bad policy. And so any notion, and these officers and these military personnel, I'm getting on a rant here, these are people who are tired of seeing the good name of the military used badly. These are people who understand that the military is something that can be used to help a situation that has become chaotic, that is broken down, that is causing suffering, where you can come in, use a little force and a wedge to create some space and some peace for people and possibly eliminate harmful individuals in an area. That's the use of good military action. And when we pervert that and when we distort that, it makes people really, really angry. When the enhanced interrogations in the Army Field Manual was signed into law, the Marine Corps was given the opportunity to change its interrogation section of its manual as well to use enhanced interrogation techniques. I want to point out the Marine Corps declined those enhanced interrogation techniques. The Marine Corps said, no, we don't need those enhanced interrogation techniques in our manual. Our interrogation technique works better. And it's a technique based on what I just described. You sit down with someone and you learn what their name is, who their family is, what village they come from, what town they come from, what their needs are, what their suffering is, and you say, you know what? I can help you. I can help you and your family and your situation. I can help your people be safe, but you got to give me some information. That's how the Marine Corps interrogation manual essentially works. You figure out how to make a rapport with someone, what they need and what they understand, help them achieve something, and then they're gladly going to help you and provide accurate information. So there are absolutely very, very dedicated men and women, officers, the cadre and warrior caste of the United States of America that has had enough. And I wouldn't be here if my entire chain of command had not had enough and said, okay, under these guidelines, we've had enough. You get to do this. You get to talk about this because we've had enough. And so in some ways, I get to kind of be the spokesperson for a whole bunch of other military officers that are not allowed to speak or given permission to speak. And I try and be honorable and speak for them. And you're right. They've had enough. And there's a lot of change that's going on because those men and women have had enough. And they are saying no to the people who have said, let's drive it into the ground and then rebuild it into some sort of better image, which is a bad idea. So I'm convinced more and more as the days go by that that change has been going on, will continue to go on. And you're just going to see more and more action where the black hats are losing and the good guys are winning, because those very serious people in the officer cadre who've sworn their lives and their families and their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers' lives, they're not going to let them die in vain. It's not going to happen. I know people who simply refuse to let every soldier that died in World War I and World War II and Vietnam die in vain by just letting this roll over our entire system with a fascist military-industrial complex. That would not be the purpose of why we fought half the wars of the 20th century. There, rant over.
Thank you. In both ways. Now,
I could keep going, but I'm going to stop myself.
Okay. Now, shifting to a question of a change in consciousness, which I know that both of you have talked about, and I think Simon has. We've discussed the date 2017 as being a rough working date. We're now toward the end of 2014, when we have some input coming both from extraterrestrial sources and also from other places that perhaps there'll be a shift of consciousness here on the planet. Does this relate to our conversation that we've been having both about Mars and about Earth and about different species at all?
Well, this shift has been going on for quite some time, Alfred. It's been building. It started very, very quietly and very hidden, and has been rolled out across the planet. 2017 is the point. That is the be-all and end-all. It's the make or break. We have 2 years or 18 months of a very rough ride between now and then, which, depending on how it goes, will dictate just how rough that ride will be. Randy, I'm sure, will be able to comment that A number of occasions that would have ended this Earth have been prevented, whether that be a nuclear bomb that was accidentally dropped from an aeroplane, whether it would be a nuclear bomb in a suitcase or a carry case that didn't go off, whether that might be a nuclear missile taken from a Russian submarine that was trapped on the bottom of the ocean bed and smuggled out, whether Mossad never actually got round to do what it needed to do to end, they've had countless opportunities to bring about the New World Order, and it hasn't happened. And I would agree with Randy. I think a number of people are seeing that it's not going to happen in the way that it's been promised. A number of very, very powerful bloodline families feel betrayed, because they were promised a new world order in which they would be the ruling elite, and it hasn't been delivered. And this is primarily what's causing the fracture amongst that ruling elite, who can basically staring down the end of a gun, because at 2017 they really will